Israel has eased some border restrictions as part of its truce with Hamas. For the first time in years, Palestinian farmers visited land in the buffer zone near the Israeli security fence this week. The Israeli Navy is also letting fishermen head further out to sea. Those may be signs of change, but one thing remains the same. There is still a great deal of uncertainty on both sides of the border. For most of the international community, the prospect of a long-term peace seems doubtful. Joining me now with more analysis on this latest conflict is Andrew Parasiliti. He's the editor of Al Monitor, a new media site dedicated to bringing in-depth coverage and fresh perspectives from the Middle East. He's also a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. Andrew, welcome to The Heat.
Thank you for having me.
It's interesting, both sides claiming victory. And you just wrote a piece for Al Monitor singling out a different victor in all of this. Tell us what your assessment is.
I think when you take a larger lens look at what happened in the last week in the Middle East, the real victor who comes out ahead is Iran. It was Iran that provided the missiles which were fired in Israel, which provoked the conflict. It is Iran whose support for Hamas and the proliferation of smaller Hamas groups that we also see developing that played a key role in bringing about the conflict, and also has a key role in whether the conflict resumes again at a future time. And let's not forget that soon after the conflict broke out and the ceasefire, that the Speaker of the Iranian parliament went to Damascus, met with President Assad, met with the head of the PFLP-GC, one of the Palestinian groups there, to make a statement that what happened, and implying that what happened in Gaza is also about what happens in Syria, where Iran also has some clear interests. And if you see the news in the last day, Speaker Larijani of Iran also made his way to Iraq, where he's also carrying a similar message. So Iran came out of the Gaza conflict proving that it has reach within Israel's borders, that it has a say in what happens in Syria, that it has a key role in Iraq, and that it too has diplomatic momentum after this conflict.
You're looking through a larger lens. Undoubtedly, Netanyahu is as well,
right.
And United States President Barack Obama, his Secretary of State Hillary Clinton as well. What are they taking away from all of this?
Well, it's a tough week for U.S. diplomacy, but let's start from this premise that the arrangement that was worked out between Hamas and Israel through Egypt, with, as we know, Iran in the background, was not brokered by the United States. Secretary Clinton came in after the deal was done to kind of preside over its completion, but the deal was signed really absent a key important U.S. role, and that's worth noting. The U.S. is now also getting some questions because soon after President Morsi got some credit for facilitating the agreement, he quickly announced his presidential decree giving himself enormous executive powers. Thank you. And now the U.S. is being questioned again as there are demonstrations happening in Egypt as we're filming this show about the future of Egypt and the prospects for democracy there.
You know, you bring up Morsi, so I'd like to talk a little bit about him because he's pledged, pretty much his allegiance to Hamas. Let's listen to this sound, and I want to get your reaction to it.
We support the people of Gaza. We are with them in their trenches. What hurts them hurts us. And the blood that flows from their children is our blood too.
So the role he's playing, the United States, as you mentioned, taking a back seat, can he really be an honest broker if he has these kind of feelings?
Well, I think we want to look at that question two ways. One is that President Morsi, coming as he did after the change in Egypt following the President Mubarak leaving office and what happened there, has to be more receptive to public opinion in Egypt. And in Egypt, public opinion is supportive of Hamas and the Palestinian situation. That's point one. Point two, when you look at what was agreed and how it was handled, it's really more of the same. Egypt has always played a moderating role, or a role between the Palestinians group and Israel. That is part of its role. And three, the question is Egypt really shown then any substantial new diplomatic power in facilitating this agreement, or is this just Egypt playing its traditional role, and that the picture, when expanded, shows that other players like Iran and others may be really behind the scenes much more significant?
You know what's interesting, Senator Joseph Lieberman earlier this week was talking about this issue and the wider Middle East. And he talked about the Pacific pivot, which has gotten so much attention, where Obama trying to pivot forces to the Pacific region. And while not saying that this is a huge miscalculation on his part, he said he feels as though the engagement should be the Middle East. It's still the big threat. Do you think that they'll analyze this, the Obama administration, and perhaps change course in a sense? Because certainly Senator Lieberman says it would be a wise idea. Yes.
The pivot toward Asia obviously was a big statement by the administration. And it's fascinating that what took place last week in the Middle East occurred as President Obama was on a historic visit to Myanmar. And he's on the phone dealing with the Middle East, and his Secretary of State has to be dispatched to the Middle East.
So the exact point that Lieberman was making.
So he can announce the pivot. Asia is extremely significant to U.S. interests globally, economically, strategically, politically, but the Middle East is not going anywhere, and it's still going to be central to U.S. foreign policy.
You were on a conference in Geneva. We had a chance to talk about this before the broadcast, and Dana Allen was talking about the Obama Doctrine when it comes to foreign policy. How would you describe an Obama Doctrine?
Well, I think President Obama has tried in this situation to manage a very difficult period of change in the region. He has had to deal with a Middle East that's going through massive uprisings, changes in leadership, and where the clarity about U.S. interests may not be so self-evident. And I think during this period, he's shown a desire to balance U.S. interests with the recognition of American values and support for democracy. This is very difficult. And the Obama administration's record in the Middle East has been a mixed one. On the Israeli-Palestinian issue, of course, he came out of, after he was elected, first day in office, announced George Mitchell as envoy, made a strong statement about Israeli settlements, and it didn't happen. And many people in the region looked and saw that as a false promise and the dashed expectation. He's tried to manage what's happening in Syria at this time. Again, time of great change. You have a situation in Bahrain, too, where you have U.S. interests and also civil unrest. So a lot going on, a lot to manage. It's always hard to classify a doctrine, but the administration has quite a full plate.
I want to talk to you a little bit about China's role. A Palestinian envoy in Beijing said on Friday that China has expressed support of the Palestinians in their conflict with Israel and bid to upgrade their status at the United Nations, which of course we know passed. China pledged $1 million in aid to Gaza after the ceasefire to help with reconstruction. Can they play an important role there? Are they?
Well, China can play a very significant role. They're a player in Asia, I mean in the Middle East, politically, economically. China has major interests in energy markets there, commercial markets. It's huge. They're a member of the Security Council, which is critical on Iran. And I think when you're out in the region and you talk to people there and leaders there, there's always a discussion about the role of China and a China that's on the rise in the region in terms of its profile out there. The question whether China gets more involved in the details and specifics of diplomacy, I think that's a broader question that China and the leadership there will be addressing.
You talked early on, and we're going to close with this question about the wider lens, and that's what Al Monitor is really all about. Yes. I remember talking to your founder, and he said that if you had been reading what was written in the Middle East, you wouldn't be surprised at the Arab Spring. It caught everybody flat-footed. What are things that are happening in the Middle East that we should have our eyes on, that we don't now, that are kind of happening in the corners or on the margins that might might boil over or might be of interest. What are some things that people are missing, would you say?
Well, I think we need to continue to watch what's happening in Iraq. U.S. troops left Iraq in December of last year, but Iraq is still an extremely important country. It has vast oil reserves that are finally developing, taking shape. It's also another fault line in this Sunni Shia sectarian struggle we're seeing throughout the region. Iraq has a close relationship with Iran, which is a key ally. It has a challenge with the Kurdistan region of Iraq, and that development which flared up just last week. And while it's toned down again, those challenges remain. And it's all connected to what's happening in Syria, where there's a Kurdish population, which is also connected to the Kurdish situation in Iraq and in Turkey. And I think when you look at Iraq and you look at the Kurdish issue and its implications in Turkey, Syria, and Iraq, I think these are areas that we need to keep our eye on in the Middle East as things happen. Of course, the other places we know well. What's happening in Israel and the West Bank and Gaza, what's happening in Syria, and what's happening in Turkey as well. Within Turkey, Turkey's Middle East policies are being questioned by many in Turkey. And they'll monitor, we cover the Turkish press every day, and we report from the Turkish press, and there's a lot of questions being asked of Prime Minister Erdogan and Foreign Minister Davutoglu about why is Turkey in this predicament where it has these problems in Syria, these problems with Iraq, these problems with Iran. And in fact, we've just reported today in an original piece that an opposition member of the Turkish parliament has called for the foreign minister's dismissal. And we're picking up these types of rumblings. So I think that's also important to watch, and it's all connected to these issues we've been discussing.
Well, it's certainly going to keep you busy, and the folks at Al Monitor. Thanks so much for coming in and talking to us.
Appreciate it.